All right, chapter 23. New era of the Great Depression. Your book opens up with a famous person this time, Henry Ford. Henry Ford, his most famous car was the Model T. Now, the Model T sold 25 million cars. I heard some years back that there are still 1 million cars registered that are registered as Model Ts. You won't see them probably when you're driving home, but if you go to car shows, you'll see them. People will take these older cars and restore them to showcase condition. If you've been to a car show, they restore the popular cars are from the 50s and 60s. I don't know what will happen in the future, how today's cars will be restored, because today's cars depend on computers. And after a certain time, manufacturers quit making certain types of computer chips. And again, I don't know what the cars of the future, how they'll restore. I mean, I don't know how people in the future restore 2019 cars or 2018 cars, but you can restore those older cars just by ordering parts from a machine shop, or even making parts in a machine shop. But in the future, I don't know if that will still be true. Henry Ford located his business in Detroit because Detroit had a lot of other industries. You know, to make an automobile, you have to have subcontractors. I mean, car companies don't make their own headlights, their own tail lights. A lot of times they don't even make their own engines. They don't make their own tires. They have to buy these things. So they'll buy tires from a tire manufacturer, and they'll buy windshield wiper blades from a windshield and wiper blade manufacturer. And you know, they buy a lot of their parts. But anyway, there was a whole lot of business factories right there in that area, and a lot of raw materials. Michigan has a lot of raw materials, particularly the upper part of Michigan, a lot of minerals. Now, Henry Ford paid his workers a big wage at the time. Catch this close, folk. $5 a day, which was a lot of money. He found it advantageous. Number one, he could pick his workers, pick the best, and number two, he could get more out of them. Then number three, he said, if I pay my workers enough, they can buy the cars I make. So a lot of his workers bought his own cars. So his idea was great. And by the way, now I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and Lockheed does the same thing, pays its workers highly. And that way it can pick its workers and keep them. A lot of Lockheed employees will sometimes become discontent, and they could walk out any time, but rarely do they. Again, I recall one Lockheed employee said one time, hey, nobody else would pay me what I'm making now for doing what I do. What did he do? He was a supervisor, so basically he did nothing, but that was something else. Anyway. He was not allowed to work. I mean, being a supervisor, he was not allowed to work. But anyway, now, I had someone in the morning class who said, my boyfriend works at Lockheed, and he knows a janitor who's making more than some of the engineers. That is true. If you've been there so many years, you can make a lot of money. Lockheed now starts you off with a low pay scale, and gradually you work your way up, but it takes 10 or 12 years to work your way up to the higher pay scales. But they have what's called a two-tier pay system. All right, anyway, leaving that. Ford's biggest contribution was the assembly line. The assembly line where he could put an automobile together about one car a minute by having one crew over here work maybe on the body, while another crew worked on the frame, and another crew worked on the engine. And eventually the engine was placed on the frame, then the body was lowered down from, you might say, lowered down from the roof or high up and sat down on the frame. But each worker would do just a small job. Like one worker might put one bolt to one nut, tighten that nut, and move this product on down the line. Another worker would put another bolt and another nut, and the work became really boring and monotonous. Today, now, a lot of that stuff is done with a machine. Airplanes cannot be put together the way automobiles are, owing to the fact that before any one crew will fly an airplane, they've got to run test after test after test. An automobile they get to a certain point in the assembly line and somebody that starts the engine, they've already filled it with gas, somebody starts the engine and the car goes off at its own power before it's actually been tested. You can't do that with an airplane. You test it and test it for days before you finally fly it. But anyway, there's no other product made quite like the automobile is. Now today, companies will try to put out automobiles at the rate of one car every 30 seconds. Really fast. Now, I was reading this morning where the automobile industry is in trouble. They put out more cars than they can produce. That's another issue. We'll talk more about that later, I promise. Henry Ford, oh yeah, one other thing. During his time, 1 out of 4 workers were working in some way with the automobile industry. Automobiles require paved roads. Most cars cannot travel over dirt roads. Automobiles require hard roads, and they require gas stations, and they require repair stations, repair shops. All this stuff. And again, somebody would build them, somebody else would repair them, somebody else would build the roads for them, somebody else would sell the gasoline for them, and et cetera, et cetera. This meant that 1 out of 4 American workers in the 1920s were employed with the automobile industry. And when the automobile industry failed, the whole economy went down with it. On the bad side, though, Henry Ford was a slave driver. He expected his workers to work too hard. He was hard against unions and refused to recognize a union. Finally, his workers all walked out in a wildcat strike en masse. Henry Ford wanted to hire the whole crew replaced, but his wife persuaded him to join the union, to not join the union, to negotiate with the union and settle the differences through a union. But he was the last of the automakers to do so. His cars were cheaper than the cars other companies put out, and this was to remain true. Now, it's not as true today as when this was to remain true for a couple of generations. The car with a Ford usually costs less than others, but it got another stigma attached to it as being inferior to other cars. Fix or repair daily. That became the logo for some people at Ford. Fix or repair daily. This was especially true during the Depression when nobody could afford to really buy a new car. So they'd hold them together with chicken wire, barbed wire, tape, any old way, string, any old way they could get them to hold together and try to keep them running. And some of those cars lasted 25 years because their owners, well, see, first came the Depression and the people couldn't buy them. And then came the war. And with the war, again, people couldn't buy them. Unfortunately, Henry Ford hated Jews, hated Catholics, hated bankers, and hated doctors. He liked the old ways. Even though he was producing an automobile, producing a modern machine, he liked the old ways. More Americans were living in the cities now than the country. At this time, the Ku Klux Klan revived. Now, why did the Ku Klux Klan revive? Well, 2 reasons. Of course, it wasn't just the blacks that the Ku Klux Klan wanted to keep down. They revived mostly because of what they called uppity women, with women getting the right to vote and women trying to get jobs in the factories and whatever like they'd done during the war. Women were making advances. The Klan tried to keep that down and you might say, put women in their place. The Klan actually has had 3 periods of revival. One was in the 1870s, during the period of Reconstruction, when they started. Then they revived again in the 1920s, mostly because of keeping out Catholics and women, keeping both of them down, and foreigners. And then in the 1960s, when I was still in high school, the Klan revived again. In all cases, they didn't pass off the scene, they were still around. What hurt the Klan in the 1920s, though, their Grand Vizier was accused, and probably he did, was accused of having raped a young woman. And at that point, the Klan got a really bad name owing to its bad policies on the part of its leader. And the Klan declined for the next 40 or so years. Now, the most important people in the nation became your businessmen, not your politicians. Businessmen like Henry Ford and others like him. Now, Harding. When I was in high school, Mr. McGuire, my history teacher, said there were two presidents whose administrations were considered failures. They were Grant and Harding. Now, this was before Watergate, keep in mind. The worst presidents we had at that time was looked on as being Harding and Grant. Now, in both cases, both men, Harding and Grant, had a problem, and Nixon did too. Nixon now is looked on by many people as being the worst, exceeding Harding and Grant. History records that any period following a war is oftentimes a period of low morality. People's morals slip when a war is over and they come back from the war. Grant, he followed the Civil War. Harding followed World War I. Nixon, Vietnam. Both of these, all three of these presidents came at the end of the war, but Harding goes down in history as one of the least capable presidents we had. If you look at his appointments were a mixture of really, really good men and really, really bad. If you could visit his cabinet, you'd see men today we know were a bunch of cronies. Now, what do I mean by a crony? A crony is a friend of yours, a gang of friends, who are known to be crooked. You might not be crooked yourself. Harding was not crooked himself, but he surrounded himself with men who were. And a lot of the men in the Ohio gang went to jail. Harding was from Ohio, and the Ohio gang became corrupt. Now, folk, I've seen two views about this, but at the beginning of Harding's administration, there was a recession. There was some author who wrote a book about this, and he called it America's Forgotten Depression. The recession was really, really bad. Almost like you'd call it a depression, but it had one characteristic. It was quickly over with, and we quickly forgot about it. How did it end? Well, your book says that Harding's response was to big business in what we call trickle-down economics. In other words, help the big man, and it will help the little man. That's now, trickle-down economics was eventually to be discredited, but if you haven't guessed already, I'm partial toward trickle-down. I mean, I think it works. But it did not work in the Depression of the 30s. But in the case of Harding, now there's another view, that when the Depression occurred, Harding did absolutely nothing about it. And the people realized their new president was not going to help them, so they all got to work and they pulled themselves out of the Depression by picking themselves up by their own bootstraps. Eight years later, we had another depression, 1929. The depression of the 1929 lasted, folks, catch it, 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933. No, it's not over yet. 1934. You're getting tired? 1935, 1936. It's still not over. 1937, it took a nosedive for the worse. 1938, 1939, it nosedived again. 1940, it ended abruptly, overnight, when President Roosevelt realized he had to make ammunition to fight a war, and all of a sudden every factory was trying to steal each other's workers, offering higher wages, and everybody who got up one morning realized that, hey, every factory in town is begging for workers, and everybody who wanted to had jobs, and the Depression was over. But that was then. But anyway, Harding did nothing. Of course, your book says that he helped big business, but whatever, the Depression ended really fast. Well, Harding was born in a zero year. I think I talked this about 0-year presidents. At that time, they all died in office. Harding was no exception. Harding went to Alaska one day, and the country was told he's sick. Well, next the country was told our president is recovering. And next, the country was told our president is dead. Kind of a shock. Now, Vice President Coolidge was up at his father's home in New Hampshire. Coolidge's father was a justice of the peace, so he was a part of the New Hampshire judiciary. About 2 or 3 in the morning, there was a knock on the Coolidge's door. The father answered. I mean, he wondered who could be calling at this ungodly hour. And if you're a justice of the peace, especially in the 1920s, and you heard a knock on your door, it was probably some couple who all of a sudden wanted to get married real fast, and they wanted the justice of the peace to marry them. And they'd pay him maybe $10, which was a lot of money back then, a $10 marriage fee, and he'd marry them real fast. That's what he guessed it would be. Instead, with a shaky voice, he turned around and called, "Calvin, come here." His son had just become president of the United States. Calvin Coolidge hurriedly got dressed. They got a family Bible out, and the father issued the oath of office to the son, having gotten word that President Harding had died. Calvin Coolidge hurriedly went to Washington to take over. He was not able to move to the White House quickly, owing to the fact that Mrs. Harding stayed in the White House as long as she could, and the White House was in shambles when the Coolidges were finally able to move in. Mrs. Harding destroyed every paper she could get her hands on that was her husband, belonged to her husband. She knew what we were not to find out for another 40 years, that her husband had been having affairs while in Hawaii with at least 2 women. This is something the book doesn't mention, but you can find it out if you research it. Harding had an illegitimate daughter while in the White House. Again, all this was kept from the public. Mrs. Harding likely knew about it. All right. Coolidge took over. In 1924, Coolidge was reelected. So Coolidge was president for about 5.5 years. During his time, the automobile came on the scene, and it changed America greatly. The automobile was ideal for the automobile industry to begin in the United States because the United States was big, and there were a lot of ground to be covered, a lot of distances to be covered. So this would make the United States, the ideal place for the automobile to get started. But also, now in the world, the whole Western world was in a mood of, let's end all wars. Let's actually end fighting. The United States and Great Britain and France partly disarmed. Japan did too. They scrapped a lot of their Navy vessels in an attempt to make sure they could not fight a war against another country, particularly overseas. So the biggest navies in the world scrapped many of their warships. The old values of savings were curtailed, and there came an attitude of spend, spend, spend. Oh, what about saving money to... No, spend it, to keep money circulating. Spend, 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 spend. Just every bit you get, spend it, don't save it. It'll keep the money circulating, keep the factories going, keep business going, so spend like crazy. This changed after the Great Depression. To help people buy installments, you could buy expensive items on the installment plan. So how do people buy their cars? Installments. Buy the car, make a monthly payment. As long as you can make monthly payments to your car. I'm not knocking it. I mean, I do it myself. How do you buy a house? Installments. Sign a contract, make the payments on the house. After so many years, the house becomes yours. It's an installment plan. You buy a radio, you can't afford it. Well, take a year to pay for it. Pay $5 a month for 12 months. That's $60. You could buy it for cash for $50, but then again, all of you know, if you buy something on an installment, you're going to wind up paying more than you will if you pay hard cash. But then again, how many of us have the hard cash to pay for a house? How many of us have the hard cash to pay for an automobile? Some of us eventually do. But so you buy these things on an installment. And this did greatly help the economy, help circulation. Buy things on installment, but basically buy, and buy. Savings, a thing of the past. Radios became commonplace. Those old radios had a hum to them because their filters were not as good as they were. You know, you always hear this in the background. And to help listening, you'd oftentimes hold your finger and use your own body as your antenna. Hold your finger to the radio's antenna. Do any of you know what I'm talking about now? Okay, one of you do. Yeah, you could. But yeah, the human body makes a fairly good antenna. The stations, they did not have powerful stations, so the receivers had to be really good, but the problem was the receivers would pick up all the static in the atmosphere in the summer. That was a lot. Now today, the FCC is, and of course technology better, the transmitters are really, really powerful. The receivers are weak compared to the ones of yesteryear, and that way the noise is kept down. But it used to be when there was a thunderstorm, you could forget about listening to radio. Now today we have FM radios, and you know, they keep the static down. But in those days, radios were noisy. Now, okay, women. You ought to have heard a speech that my 8th grade history teacher made about giving women the right to vote. She was a woman herself. She was hard against it. She said before women had the right to vote, a man, when he saw a woman, would doff his hat, bow down, and stop and play gentleman a while. The men and women were usually polite to each other. In the meantime, a man who lived on Nikola Tesla refused to marry. He said, I grew up dreaming of having a wife who'd be a woman. And he said, now the days women are not women, and he would not marry any one of them. He said that women cease to be women. Now, be that as it may, I want to say this, though, about those Victorian women. They were always complaining about their aches and pains. I don't think that goes on with women as much today. It is believed that a lot of their aches and pains were imagined in their head more than it was an actual ailment. But they were just all the time hurting. Now, my mother was that way. A friend of mine at Lockheed said her mother was that way. The old-time women used to always be doing that. But anyway, women got liberated somewhat in the 1920s. Instead of taking up with politics, which they quickly found they knew nothing about and was a man's game anyway, they became dance girls. They went to the bars. They became the flappers. They began to cut their hair as short as a man's, basically called bob. They bobbed their hair. They dressed skimpily, really scantily, threw off most of their clothing, in other words. They began to smoke and drink, smoke cigarettes, drink alcohol, and basically entertain the men in the bars. Nightclubs were formed, and the women would get in the nightclubs, and they made a permanent change in America's nightlife. Then when it came to working, they worked mostly in jobs as secretary or teacher, which had been women's jobs beforehand. They seldom proceeded into jobs that were reserved for men. Folk, you might find one woman in 100,000 who are interested in electronics. Electronics got me into Lockheed. It got me out of the teaching profession and into Lockheed. You might wonder, why did I leave teaching? Well, for the same reason. My wife bumped into a janitor one time in a mall. She got to talk to this janitor and found out this woman, janitor, had once been a school teacher. But she said, I quit teaching because I get more respect here mopping floors than I did as a teacher in today's public schools. I got more respect at Lockheed than I did as a school teacher. Made more money too, but that was something else. Anyway, today's public schools I don't think they can be fixed. But what I was starting to ask is how many women are interested in electronics? The electronics industry is a 99.9% male industry. And it's not just that women won't go into this field. A few women. I mean, I once took my car, I take my car to an authorized dealership. Pay more money but get better service. Occasionally, I'll talk to a female mechanic. There aren't many of them. Why? The women don't choose to go into auto mechanics. All right, if I'm wrong, you're welcome to say so.
Computer science major.
What's that?
I'm a computer science major.
Excellent. Computer science is one thing. Circuit board electronics is a little bit different. You might think it's the same. It's not quite the same.
So you're talking more mechanical electronics and not necessarily computer technology.
Okay.
I'm a diesel technician. I rebuild diesel engines.
You rebuild diesel engines? Okay.
But I'm the only woman in the shop.
Yeah.
You're the only woman in the shop.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Technology.
All male otherwise. Yeah. Again. All right. Now, prohibition. Leaving a woman's issues for a while. Prohibition came about as a result of the 18th Amendment. Prohibition was supposed to reduce crime. Now, folk, again, the people who passed it had no idea. Now, you have to remember, I mentioned earlier in this lecture that every time you make a change, the change has some unforetold or unpredicted side effect. Prohibition actually increased crime. And don't get me wrong, I'm against drinking. I never touch the stuff. And yet, I believe that this issue is better off if left up to each individual to decide for himself or herself, rather than being decided by government mandate. The nations of the world that prevent drinking seldom make any kind of scientific or technological progress. So what's the connection between drinking and scientific progress? If you prohibit one freedom, you prohibit all of them. Only free people invent. Now, when I was in the 6th grade, there was an election year, 1960, and John Kennedy was running for president. My teacher, Mrs. Adkins by name, said, you'll never guess how Mr. Kennedy got his money. Not the son, but the father. She wouldn't tell us. So I went home and asked Dad, Dad, how did the Kennedy family get their money? He said, bootlegging. Getting this alcohol and selling it illegally and not having to pay taxes on it. People would go deep into the woods and set up a still, deep out of sight of the government revenues, set up a still, distill spirits, as they called them, and sell it for a big profit without paying taxes. And I mentioned how that even though drinking was illegal, these women began to drink, oftentimes alcohol that was made by, made by distillers, illegal distillers, or sold by bootleggers. The gangsters came up, men like Al Capone, John Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly, Babyface Nelson. All these men had a lot to do with prohibition. Some of them might not have been criminals had it not been for prohibition, but the gangsters of the 1920s, that was to persist in the 1930s, came about. Eventually, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th. The Equal Rights Amendment was gotten up, but it failed. The Equal Rights Amendment is one of the few amendments that got past Congress but could not get through the states. Harlem created a new African culture. As Africans made more gangs. Your book also mentions Greenwich Village. where the people would dress in an outlandish manner. Greenwich Village still exists, and the people there are nonconformists by most standards. Harlem got so powerful it could send its own man to Congress, its own representative. Always a black man, of course. All right, folk, I'll tell you this. I told the other class.